Good morning to all of you who are with this gathering of the Center for Public Democracy. I told my good friend, Brother Whitley, it wasn't necessary to do an introduction because we who believe in freedom know who each other are. My name is Reverend William Barber. I am from North Carolina. I am with the Moral Monday Movement and with the revival Time for a Moral Revolution, a moral revolution of values in this country. Somebody's hurting, my brother and my sisters, and it's gone on far too long. So I cannot come here today without first speaking to the cries of mourning and death in our nation. Before I could finish weeping about Baton Rouge, where Alton Sterling was killed, shot point blank in the chest. Another shooting happened less than a day later in Minnesota, where Philando Castile was killed while in a car simply trying to comply. And then the president went on TV and played it with us to do better and made the point that racism is not just a matter of emotion, but it's data-driven. And then across this nation, blacks, whites, Latinos, Asians, Muslims, Christian, Jews, young and old came together in peaceful, nonviolent solidarity, not so much, as one brother said, to show black anger, but to show black grief, but to come together across even racial lines to protest racism. And then in the midst, a killer struck, hijacked the peaceful protest, used them as a staging ground to kill target police who were watching over our children and families. And this particular brother we now know, who's dead, was a former soldier. Shots rang out. Some say 50, some say 60, who knows? In less than 72 hours, 2 lives, 2 souls of black men dead, 5 lives, 5 souls of policemen of different races dead, many wounded, 2 fathers, 2 sons, 2 brothers just trying to make it, were killed by those who are supposed to protect and serve. 5 officers, 5 public servants, 5 members of families killed and shot while trying to protect and serve. 1 killed while selling CDs. 1 killed while trying to comply with the law. 5 killed trying to uphold the peace and protect the people. 2 black men wrongfully and brutally killed by the police. Now 2 black police chiefs, one whose brother was killed in the line of service, whose partner was killed in the line of service. 1 black police chief that said the reason he became a chief was to fight so that things like what happened to Michael Brown wouldn't happen, and now 2 black chiefs are trying to protect the city and trying to console families. 5 shots in Baton Rouge, 4 shots in Minnesota, 50 or more in Dallas, but each shot heard around the world, inflicting more wounds in our already bullet-shredded nation's soul. This is Shakespearean. There's nothing easy about it. This is violence and death gone wild. The sound of bullets, pictures of death and violence, not love and humanity, but hate and inhumanity. Terrorism, domestic, sometimes behind a badge, sometimes without a badge. And whether it's the violence and police terror by those who misuse the badge, or whether it's violence and terror against those who wear the badge and are doing their duty, it's wrong, and violence will only beget more violence. And it is possible to be outraged by both if you're in touch with your humanity. The reality is, the first person who called me and was outraged by the killing in Baton Rouge and the killing in Minnesota was a police officer. called me and said, "This is nothing but racism behind the badge." The first person that called me that was outraged about the police officers who were trying to do the right thing being shot and targeted was a police officer. Same police officer had dual outrage, because when you're a human being, you hate death and violence in any form toward anybody. And so in this moment, we must mourn for those killed and the families left behind, and we need to have prophetic mourning, because that kind of mourning will lead us, hopefully, to a place higher. For the Bible says, when my heart is overwhelmed, lead me to the rock that is higher. What must we do in this moment? In this moment, we must denounce violence and embrace nonviolence, and that's not weakness. That's just choosing that when you fight something, you will not become what you fight. That's what nonviolence is about. I'm not going to fight hate and become a hater. I'm not going to fight violence and become violent. I'm not going to fight guns and become a gun carrier. I'm going to be better when my heart is overwhelmed. Lead me. What must we do in this moment? In this moment, we must still deal with the reality of police brutality and shootings and wrongful death. Far too many black and brown and poor people, and the data-driven truth about racial disparity can't be ignored in the criminal justice system. We can't push it under the rug. We can't even believe that what we see that's captured on the video is everything. That's just the tip of the iceberg. Somebody tell Rudy Giuliani. The other day on Fox News, he said, while I was mayor, I only had 3 cases. Come on, Rudy. We have to have federal protections. We have to have federal protections and prosecutions. We have to have federally funded body cam. We can't leave that up to a state's budget or to a city's budget. We have to have intense screening of anyone hired to be a police person on the front end. We need to know how they're hooked up on the front end, what they're doing on their computer on the front end, who they were raised by on the front end, what are their sentiments on the front end. Because a gun and a badge and the power of the state is too much power to give to a bigot and a racist. And unless you have the highest regard for all human beings, regardless of their race, their creed, their class, or their sexuality, you are automatically disqualified from being called to protect and serve. And then, I'm also president of the NAACP. We've had a lot of deaths down through the years. I've had death threats, but black people and poor people have never called for lynch mobs. But we do want real trials and real convictions and consequences, especially when we see a rogue police person do on camera. If we had done the same thing on camera, we would have been locked up and the key would have been thrown away automatically. And that is not being anti-police, that is being anti-abuse of your police power. In this moment, we must also honor all of the officers of the law that do serve and that do protect and do love the community, and who every day try to do the right things in protecting their families and ours. In this moment, we must address homegrown terror, and we must deal with it. And we cannot merely call something terrorism when we think they may be Muslim and connected. Dalen Roof was homegrown terrorism. And we must deal with the proliferation of guns and the law that allows guns and assault rifles to be carried right out in the open in the crowd. That night in Dallas, the sniper could have walked right through the crowd with an AK-47. That is crazy. It makes no sense at all. And we need to say to those like Mr. Trump, who has said if you could give everybody more guns, we'd be safer. Well, Mr. Trump, the police department in Dallas, even with all their guns and all their expertise, they had to use a robot to get the killer. Guns are not going to protect us. And in this moment, America can't act like this is new. I don't like saying it, but America has a deeply violent history. If you just go back to August, there's an article that says August 1st, 1966, there have been 126 events in which 4 or more people were killed by a shooter, over 800 people. And just in the last 2 years, 9 in a church, 23 in a restaurant, 26 in an elementary school, including first graders, 49 in a club. That's history. That's recent history. And it doesn't even include the episodes from America's past, like Tulsa in 1941, when in the early 1900s, when hundreds of African Americans were killed by guns, by Molotov cocktails, and left homeless. That's why it is dangerous sometimes for the media to say this is the worst case or the worst violence we've seen. Just, it's bad, it's bad, but don't say it's the worst, because you dismiss what happened to Native Americans. You dismiss what happened to union leaders back in the early 1900s. You dismiss what happened to black veterans. We have had violence in this country, and enough is enough. And we're never going to deal with it as long as we have selective amnesia. We have to deal with our gun laws. We have to deal with them, put our police at risk. And there is a moral call now. The moral call is we need to establish justice and provide for the common defense and promote the general welfare, secure the domestic tranquility. Those are the guideposts that must lead us now. The guideposts that must lead us now are the deepest values of our most sacred religious traditions: faith, justice, mercy, equality. Partisan politics is not going to get us where we need to be now. More hateful political rhetoric and hateful policies and giving a license to hate with the biggest microphone in the country, the platform of the presidency, is not going to help us. More guns as a solution is not going to help us. Denying racism is not going to help us. And a misguided disdain for all police is surely not going to help us. And more violence is not going to help us in this moment where the whole nation has on the ashcloth, the sackcloths and ashcloths of mourning. Now, while death is staring us in the face and blood is streaming, crying from the ground, streaming through the internet, crying from the front seat of a car. Now, as we can see inhumanity up close, we have to choose to do better and choose to be more human and choose to be more loving, choose to be more sane. Maybe now we need to combine all of these marches and have a massive sit-in in the capital of D.C. until the gun laws are changed. I come this morning to tell you why, clergy, we're leading something called the Revival, time for a moral revolution of values all across this country. We'll be in Cleveland Monday night delivering a higher ground moral declaration to the RNC, and then next week to the DNC, because there has to be a group of people that challenges every political party. Why in September we are organizing states to march on state capitals, where those capitals have the worst gun laws and the worst attacks on the poor and the worst attacks on health care and the worst attack on voting rights and the worst attacks on poor people, because it all intersects. And we must finally deal with the culture of violence. Coretta Scott King carried some words that I carry with me in my heart. Not long after her husband was hunted and killed and shot down by a system of racism, hatred, and a sniper filled with hatred and that shot him through his jaw and blew out his spine, somebody asked her, Coretta, what do you think about violence? And she said, well, violence is more than just when you shoot somebody. She said, poverty can produce a deadly kind of violence. She said, in a society where you starve children, that's violence. Suppressing a culture is violence. Neglecting school children is violence. Discrimination against working people is violence. Not paying a living wage is violence. Ghetto housing is violence. Ignoring medical needs is violence. Contempt for equality is violence. Denying racism is violence. And then she said, even a lack of willpower to do something about it and to help humanity is a sick and sinister form of violence. And so we must decide to be on the side of nonviolence too by challenging the very culture of violence. When we see a certain Sly as a Fox News station continuing to feed dishonest race and class-based reporting with no shame, that's cultural, social, political violence. When a former congressperson has been applauded by many after just the other day, he tweeted, 3 Dallas cops killed, 7 wounded. This is now war. Watch out, Obama. Watch out, Black Lives Matter punks. Real America is coming after you. That's violence. That's cultural, social, political violence. There's a book entitled now, Racism Without Racists. It declares that nobody will really say they're racist now. In fact, when people get into a conversation about racism, my brother Keith Ellis and I were talking about this, they immediately want to say, well, we don't know what's in people's heart. Well, that's not where you prove racism. Racism is not proved by what's in your heart and what's in your mind. Racism is proved by your policies and what you do. And then sociologist Glenn Lowry says that in almost every measurable measure of well-being, wages, unemployment, income, prison enrollment, crime victimization, health, mortality, we see racism and disparate treatment. But the reason that many folk say there's no racism, because ever since the white Southern strategy that was developed by Kevin Phillips and employed by George Wallace and then Richard Nixon and then Ronald Reagan, they developed a lexicon to talk racist without sounding racist. Kevin Phillips said, we can't say the N-word anymore. We can't use race, so let's call it tax cuts. Let's call it entitlement reform. Let's call it law and order. Let's call it states' rights. George Wallace used it. Go read his 1968 speech in Madison Square Garden and read Donald Trump and you'll understand where he got his cliff notes from. Ronald Reagan perfected it when he went to the Neshoba County Fair in Philadelphia, Mississippi, where Swana, Cheney, and Goodman were killed, and he held his presidential opening debut, and he used every code word. And then there's a new code word for racism. It doesn't sound racist. They just say liberal. There's a book that says only the willful deaf cannot hear the deaf dog whistle politics of calling President Obama the food stamp president, or gutting voting rights, or blocking Medicaid in the states where 6 out of 10 black people live. Even though in those states there are more white people that denied Medicaid expansion than blacks, but the narrative that gets people against it is to what one writer calls you blackanize an issue. And then you can get people to vote against their own self-interest. And that's why in this country, we better have a grown-up conversation about racism. We've got to raise the question, what is it that trumps common sense? 8 million more white people poor than black people, 5 million more white people poor than Latinos, and yet in the 300 and some odd counties with the highest poverty rates, we're electing candidates to have the most adverse position toward the policies that would help the poor. What trumps common sense? Dog whistle politics, camouflage, race baiting, that's violence. When we see the ungodly pornographic sums of money being used to turn out what is a possible democracy into a dollarocracy. That's violence. When you pass voter suppression laws, the worst one now coming out of North Carolina, right after Shelby. When the Shelby decision went down, one of our legislators said openly, now that the headache has been removed. When you see that these laws are being passed in the states that have had recently the highest black turnout, and the potential for fusion politics and coalition politics where whites and blacks and brown peoples can come together. When we sit right now in the United States, where the U.S. Attorney General today has less power to deal with protect voting rights than the U.S. Attorney General had in 1965. When we are walking back across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And you must understand, my brothers and sisters, particularly my white brothers and sisters, that voting rights is not a black issue. It negatively and disparately impacts black, brown, and poor white people. But voting rights, when you undermine voting rights, you undermine labor rights. You undermine health care. You undermine public education. You undermine living wages. Because if you suppress the vote, you can't build the coalitions that are necessary to unelect the people that are passing the bad policies. And we must understand, we've had all these presidential debates. Think about it. And not one of them had 15 minutes on voting rights. Not one of them. Not one candidate has stood up and done a major speech on voting rights while they're asking people to vote for them. And sometimes in the progressive community, we've talked about everything else but voting rights. 51 years after the voting rights in 1965, we have less. The Shelby decision gutted the Voting Rights Act. That's why many of the folk will say, yes, Donald Trump is racist, but I'm going to still vote on him, because they're not looking at him, they're looking at the Supreme Court. They're looking at the restoration of voting rights. That's why the Congress of these United States has engaged in a more than 1,000-day filibuster, refusing to fix the Voting Rights Act. Strom Thurmond only filibustered the 1957 Civil Rights Act for 24 hours. That means this Congress has filibustered 990 days or more longer than Strom Thurmond. And in any other country, there would be massive nonviolent outrage over people taking the right to vote and suppressing the right to vote. And if we're going to be so-called progressive coalitions, even in progressive and so-called liberal coalition, you can't try to find every way to not talk about race. Race and class, somebody says, is it race and class? Answer them and say, it is. Don't try to separate the two. Let me tell you, and I'm through this, how serious this is on voting rights. I know we're in Pittsburgh, but let me say something about the nation. In this nation, there are 11 southern states, former Confederate states: Virginia, Georgia, South Carolina, Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, Texas, Georgia, Florida. Those states, most of them were covered by the Voting Rights Act. They're not covered now, but Section 5, which means the legislatures can pass anything they want, and we only get to fight them in court, but that is after the laws have suppressed the vote. Now, what does that mean? What does it mean if you control 11 states, 11 southern states, and you're running for president? It means you get 160 electoral votes. That means you only need 112 electoral votes from the other 39 states. If you can control 11 southern states, where I'm from, you control 22 seats in the United States Senate, which means you only need 4 from the other 39 states to control the Senate. If you can control those 11 states, you control 31% of the United States Congress, which means you only need 20% from the other 39 states. You control 11 governors who control boards of election. I'm here to tell you, if we are concerned about America, we better be concerned about the Southern strategy. And not only must we fight in the Rust Belt, and not only must we fight in the Midwest, but we better fight down south and break open the solid South. And we need to understand that there is a crowd that is saying to America now, if you really want to be great, the way to be great is to attack labor rights. You want to be great, deny living wages. You want to be great, elect me, and we'll deny health care. If you want to be great, attack the LGBT community. If you want to be great, deny immigrant rights. If you want to be great, castigate an entire religion like Islam. If you really want to be great, attack voting rights. If you really want to be great, find you some preachers that will declare that the only moral issues in the public square are where you stand on homosexuality, prayer in the school, and abortion, which, by the way, is a form of heresy. Because there are 2,500 scriptures in the Bible that deal with love, justice, mercy, and how you treat your neighbor. There might be 5 scriptures in the Bible that deal with homosexuality. Most of them are misinterpreted, and not one of them trumps this scripture. You still got to love your neighbor as yourself. Don't mess with me. I brought my book with me. It's time that we take on the religious right that is so wrong. It is time that we take on people who call themselves white evangelicals, where they spend more time being white than evangelical. The Bible I read says in Isaiah 10, woe unto those who legislate evil and rob the poor of their rights. The Bible that I read says in Matthew 25, to the nations, not to individuals, and about giving somebody a turkey during Thanksgiving. It says to the nations, when I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was naked, did you clothe me? When I was in prison, did you come see about me? We need a moral revolution of values in the public square. And we need to understand our connection. I understand you all are building a coalition. This is the first time, and I'm through. First time you met. You don't need any more organizations. You can keep your silo, but we better understand in our silos, there's some times we got to come together. And we need to understand we got to organize from the bottom up. Because change doesn't come from D.C. down. It comes from Birmingham and Montgomery and Greensboro up. And we need to stop looking for one Messiah and recognize that in every area, we are all called to be leaders. We're all called to be transformative. The March on Washington didn't happen because Dr. King said, come march. It happened because there were 300 actions going on in cities and states and counties around the country. And tell your neighbor, say, neighbor, you better understand something. I don't know what, tell them, I don't know what your issue is. But let me tell you from the podium, the same groups that are fighting immigration reform are fighting labor rights. And the same groups that are against voting rights are against public education. And the same people that are xenophobic and Islamophobic are against the LGBT community. And the same people that are fighting the environment are also fighting criminal justice reform. And the same people that are fighting criminal justice reform are fighting women's rights. And if they are cynical enough to be together, we damn sure ought to be smart enough to come together. So it's time. It's time, my friends. It's time for fusion politics. It's time for us to build an anti-racism, anti-poverty, pro-labor, pro-justice, deeply moral, deeply constitutional, moral revolution. It's time. We don't need to have another conference trying to figure out what the agenda is. If we don't know what the agenda is by now, is something wrong with us. I'm leaving the podium, but let me see if is this the agenda. The agenda is we need to secure in this democracy economic sustainability. And we need to deal with poverty and full employment and labor rights and living wages. Number two, we need to have educational equality for every child, guaranteeing that they receive a high quality, well-funded, constitutional, diverse public education. Number three, we need health care for all, starting with access to the Affordable Care Act, but getting to universal health care. We need to protect Medicare and Medicaid and women's health and Social Security and environmental protection. We need, number four, we need to demand fairness in the criminal justice system by addressing the continuing inequalities in that system for black people and brown people and even poor white people. Number five, if we want a great democracy, we need to protect and expand voting rights and civil rights and women's rights and LGBTQ rights and labor rights and immigrant rights and never back down from equal protection under the law. And this is not about one election. This is about electing to build a movement. And so I'm a preacher. She gave me my time is up, but the Spirit said, just say this. Hey, Lord, a few Sundays ago, it was Pentecost. And in my faith tradition, Pentecost is when scattered and scared disciples that were being beat up by an oppressive government, male and female of different races. Their leader had been crucified, and they were trying to shut them down. They were trying to stop the movement. Rome was, and Rome was powerful. Rome had money. Rome had a police force. But then those disciples, male and female, all different races, they came together in an upper room in Pittsburgh. They came together in an upper room. And while they were in that upper room, they got power to fight on anyhow. We call it Pentecost. We call it moral power. It made them unstoppable. A new wind blew. Fire of justice began to inspire them. They started speaking in other tongues, the tongues of love and justice instead of the tongue to hate. I got a question for this gathering. Could it be that it's time for us to lead America to a political and social Pentecost? Could it be time? Could it be time for all of us to come together? Could it be time for a new fire to burn? Could it be time for new wind to blow? Could it be time for new tongues to speak? I feel the Spirit in this room. I'm here to tell you, when we all get together, when black and white abolitionists got together, they beat slavery. When women like Sojourner Truth and Elizabeth Staten got together, they were able to win. When the devotees of the civil rights movement came together, they beat Jim Crow. When Moses and his rod got together, the sea opened. When David and his slingshot and his faith got together, the giants fell. When Esther and Mordecai got together, the plots were found out. When Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego got together. I know what happens. They told me years ago I'd never walk again. But when my doctors and my therapists and my pharmacists got together, when my family and the church and the prayer warriors and my faith got together, I can jump now. I can run now. I feel power in this room when we all get together, when we all vote together, when we all march together, when we all stand together, when we all go to jail together. What a day! 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 What a day!